You ever noticed how the first number you hear in a negotiation just seems to stick? Like it sets the tone for everything that comes after? Well, that is not your imagination. Today, we're diving into a really powerful cognitive bias called the anchoring effect. It's this hidden force that's guiding your decisions every single day, and most of the time, you don't even know it's happening.
So to really understand just how strange and powerful this is, we're going to kick things off with a classic experiment. It comes from two legends in psychology, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and it all starts with a rigged wheel and a number that makes absolutely no sense.
So let me just ask you this. Do you think a totally random, completely meaningless number, one you know is just plucked out of thin air, could actually change your answer to a serious, factual question? I mean, most of us would probably say, no way, of course not. But, well, the truth is a little surprising.
So here's what they did. The setup was super simple. They brought students in and spun this wheel of fortune. Now the trick was, the wheel was rigged. It could only land on two numbers, 10 or 65. The students would watch the wheel spin, write down whatever number came up, and then they were asked two basic questions about the percentage of African nations in the UN. And the results were just wild. That number from the wheel, which everybody in the room knew was completely random, had this massive effect on their answers. For the group that saw the number 10, their average guess was 25%. But the group that saw 65, their average guess shot all the way up to 45%. That meaningless number literally dragged their final answer along for the ride.
So what in the world is going on here? This bizarre thing has a name, and I promise you, once you learn it, you're going to start seeing it everywhere. So let's define it. What exactly is an anchor?
This is what's called the anchoring effect. It's just our brain's natural tendency to grab onto the very first piece of information we get. That's the anchor, and then use it as a starting point for everything else. We make our judgments by moving away from that anchor, but here's the real kicker. We almost never move far enough away.
And believe me, this isn't just some weird thing that happens in a lab. It's everywhere. Think about the sticker price on a car, or the first salary someone throws out in a job interview. You ever see a sign in a grocery store that says limit 12 per person? That's an anchor. It makes you think buying 10 cans of soup is reasonable. They're all anchors, and they're all setting the stage for what you do next.
Okay, so the big mystery now is why. Why are our brains so easily fooled by these anchors? Well, it turns out there isn't just one simple reason. Psychologists have figured out that there are actually two different things happening in our minds, kind of like two different culprits working on the case.
So let's meet our two culprits. First, we have a deliberate, conscious process. This is run by our slow, logical brain, what Kahneman calls System 2. We call this anchoring as adjustment. The second culprit is totally different. It's an automatic, subconscious suggestion run by our fast, intuitive System 1, and that's called anchoring as priming. Let's break them both down.
So, first up is adjustment. This is the one you can actually feel happening. You get a number, you know it's probably not right, so you consciously try to adjust it to get closer to the real answer. It's an active process. But the thing is, it takes mental effort. And our logical system too, well, it can be a bit lazy. We tend to stop adjusting as soon as we land on a number that feels plausible, not necessarily the number that's most accurate.
Here's a great way to see it in action. Let me ask you, what's the boiling point of water at the very top of Mount Everest? Just take a second and think about how your mind tries to figure that out.
I bet I know what you did. Your brain immediately grabbed an anchor it knows for a fact, 100 degrees Celsius, right? The boiling point at sea level. You know the pressure is lower up on a mountain, so you start adjusting down from there. You might think, okay, so not 100, maybe 90 or 85, but you probably stopped way before you got to the correct answer, which is actually around 71 Celsius. You adjusted, but you didn't adjust enough.
But adjustment only explains half the story. The other mechanism, priming, is much sneakier. This is all the work of our automatic System 1. With priming, the anchor isn't a starting point for a calculation. Instead, it works like a subconscious suggestion, quietly bringing up related ideas and feelings that color your judgment.
Now, to see this in action, let me ask you a completely absurd question. Was Gandhi more or less than 144 years old when he died? I know, it's a ridiculous question. The answer is obviously less. But that number, 144, does something really weird to your brain without you even noticing.
So even though your conscious mind completely rejects 144 as impossible, your associative brain, your System 1, has already been primed. That huge number automatically activated a whole network of ideas, ancient, very old, long life, wise. So later, if someone asks you to guess Gandhi's actual age, those ideas are still floating around in your head and they unconsciously pull your final guess much, much higher than it would have been.
Okay, so now we know what anchoring is and the two ways it gets into our heads. Let's take a look at how this plays out in the real world. Because the effects, they're not just some small, quirky thing. They can be incredibly dramatic, with some really serious consequences. So in one study, people were asked to guess the height of the tallest redwood tree. But before they guessed, they were given either a really high anchor or a really low one. The result? A massive 55% anchoring index. What that means is for every 100 feet of difference between the high and low anchors, people's estimates shifted by 55 feet. That's huge!
Now you might be thinking, okay, but that's for regular people. Experts would be immune to this, right? Wrong. They tested professional real estate agents, giving them different listing prices for the same house. The agents were just as anchored as anyone else, with a 41% index. But here's the craziest part. When they were asked about it, they all swore that the listing price had absolutely zero influence on their professional judgment. But the numbers don't lie.
This next example is, frankly, pretty unsettling. A group of experienced German judges were asked to decide on a prison sentence for a shoplifter. But right before they did, they had to roll a pair of dice that were loaded to only land on a 3 or a 9. The judges who rolled a 9 gave an average sentence of 8 months. The ones who rolled a 3, they gave an average of 5 months. A completely random roll of the dice changed a prison sentence by more than 50%.
It turns out anchors even affect how generous we are. In one charity experiment, when people weren't given any anchor, they donated an average of $64. But when the suggestion was a low anchor of just $5, the average donation crashed to only $20. And when they were given a high anchor of $400, the average donation skyrocketed to $143. That first number they saw basically set their budget.
Okay, I know this all sounds a little bleak, like we're just puppets being controlled by random numbers. But we're not. And here's the good news. Once you understand how this works, you can actually start to fight back against it. So, how do you resist the pull of an anchor?
There's a really effective 3-step strategy. First, and this is the most important, you have to acknowledge the anchor. Just recognize that it's there and that it might be influencing you. Awareness is half the battle. Second, actively question it. Don't just adjust from it, search for reasons why that anchor is totally wrong. And third, you have to deliberately think the opposite. If someone gives you a high anchor, force yourself to build the strongest possible case for a much, much lower number. You're basically waking up your logical brain to fight back.
Now, in a really high-stakes situation, like a big negotiation, Kahneman says you need to be even more aggressive. If the other side throws out an outrageous anchor, don't even legitimize it with a counteroffer. He says you should basically make a scene. You should make it crystal clear, to them and to yourself, that you will not continue the negotiation with that number even on the table. You're hitting a reset button and refusing to play in their sandbox.
And all this really leaves us with one last big question to think about for ourselves. We've seen how a random number can sway a judge's sentence, how a list price can fool an expert. So take a second and really think. What invisible anchors floating around in news headlines, on price tags, and everyday conversations, what anchors are secretly guiding your decisions today?